today for our talk as part of the Science Communication Education Research Network. So our network is part of an NSF Coordination Award aimed at improving science communication education through research and practice. We bring together scholars and practitioners from education, sciences, and communication disciplines to exchange knowledge on ways to improve the future of science communication. We're particularly focused on building the field of science communication education and establishing effective training for the next generation of science communicators to build bridges across a polarized society. So today we are going to ask you to do just 2 short breakout rooms, only 90 seconds, to make very quick connections with one another. I wanted to give you a heads up on that before we introduce our speaker today. So today we have with us, we're so excited to introduce Dr. Heather Akin. So she is an assistant professor of strategic communication at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where her research program focuses on the social psychology of food, science, and the environment. She investigates how strategic communications and media influence attitudes and behaviors, including how communication can correct misinformation, something that I'm confident most of us can agree is increasingly important at this moment in time. Today, Dr. Akin is going to draw from her expertise to present best practices for communicating across social divisions and discuss how we might impart this knowledge to our science students so that we can create a new generation of scientists equipped with the skills to bridge divides about science in society. All right, but before we get started, as I gave you a little bit of a warning, we are one of our main goals is to connect researchers and practitioners across disciplines. We are going to facilitate a quick connection point for those in attendance before we get started. We're going to ask you to join a breakout room of 2 to 3 people, so a small group, and just introduce yourself. So take 30 seconds to say your name, your current position and affiliation, and just why you decided to attend this talk today. We're only going to be in the room for 90 seconds, so this will just be a quick connection. When we come back, Dr. Akin will begin her presentation.
To commit. Maybe it's already summer for you, and then I super appreciate you being here today. I'm really excited to present to this group. Since I've been invited to do it, I've been thinking about a lot of different ideas that I wanted to kind of share and hear feedback about, field any questions about, maybe have a discussion. And I really just appreciate the invitation to be part of this group. I see people that I've known from University of Nebraska, a couple of people from graduate school. So this is just an amazing network that's being created in this process. So today I wanted to do a talk kind of coming from the field of someone working in the area of science communication research specifically. So I kind of want to talk through some theories and some models and also some kind of activities and exercises I've been doing in the field of science communication that I thought would be relevant and interesting to the network. Hopefully so. I did share with Liz and Aaron the other day that I have some things in this presentation that are kind of new and kind of experiments and ideas that I wanted to throw out there, and I am appreciative of the opportunity to do so. I think to start off, we had a poll that we were going to share via Zoom, and there it is, all ready to go. Thank you, Aaron. So the first question that I wanted to pose to you all to kind of get a sense of our own experiences with this idea of communicating about issues that we are all hearing a lot about now, all talking about, thinking about, perhaps too much overthinking about, whatever the case might be, thinking about how this is impacting our students as well. Think about when the last time you talked to someone you disagree with about a controversial science topic. And this might be, climate change, vaccines, GMOs, something that maybe you knew was different from, you had a view that was different from the person you're speaking with. And what I'm saying, it looks like we have folks that have done this pretty recently. Some that fairly can't remember having a conversation like this, which I understand because in a lot of ways our communication environment is not really set up to always have these conversations very well. So that was something I was wondering if we would see, and we did. It also looks like one of the questions was, how did it go? And many are saying it went okay, maybe not terrible, maybe not great. That sounds about right. I hope that we have a chance today to talk about how those conversations can go. And I have a few ideas to share about ways that we might think about that. So just to kind of get us started too, I wanted to share a little bit about my background, just because I think it helps explain a lot of where my work comes from and how it's kind of evolved over the years. And I think also for the sake of us building a network, if any of us cross paths at the conference next month, that perhaps we can talk and connect at some point about that. So I am a faculty member at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and I'm actually in a really pretty small and unique program that is based on our college, in our university's ag campus. Some of you that might be in land grant institutions have colleges of agriculture. That's where I am based, in a college of agriculture and natural resources. And I'm in a pretty small program that's focused on leadership, education, and communication, specifically related to agriculture and natural resources. However, my background is really more in the study of communication, mass communication, and science communication. I have my PhD from University of Wisconsin and did a lot of work there in the area of public opinion perceptions about complex science issues, testing media messages and things like that. And that work really continued when I did a postdoc at the Ann Arbor Public Policy Center in the science of science communication, where I did research pretty much full time on public's perceptions about science, with the idea that it's really critical that we understand where publics are coming from on some of these issues. There's a lot of, one thing I'll talk about today is sometimes the misperceptions that we have about what the public thinks about scientific topics, or we kind of, discredit some of those beliefs and things like that. But with research, I think research can really support our understanding of where publics are coming from sometimes, that it's often very complex how people shape their views about controversial science topics, I'm thinking about this right now with AI a lot, that we hear a lot about AI. We don't always necessarily, I'm even doing some work in understanding public's perceptions of it, but it's advancing so quickly. I don't really always understand the technology. It's really important for us to kind of gauge what publics are thinking, engage with publics when we can, to really understand that. So that's what a lot of that work that I did in my postdoc did. Then I actually went to the University of Missouri and was in their School of Journalism for a couple of years, and then ended up coming back to my hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska, much to my surprise. I grew up here in Nebraska, but heard about an opportunity, and my family lives here. I actually used to work here when I was in college, on this campus when I was in college in the agronomy department. And it was just seemed kind of like a perfect time to come back. However, my research kind of shifted, and I share that with the network just because I wanted to kind of share that sometimes our research becomes kind of place-based in some ways. And my appointment, the current work that I'm doing, is really shifted because of both the kind of apportionment that I have as a faculty member. I have a teaching appointment and an extension appointment, which is kind of unique to land grant universities, but I work with extension and do research in that area. And so some of my work has shifted more toward what is going on in the state that I live in, and what is going on in rural communities in Nebraska, given some work that I do with rural, a project called the Rural Poll, where we survey rural Nebraskans every year. But some of the essence of it is still the same. What we're trying to understand people's perceptions of science. And I also am working with a very different group of students than I originally, was kind of working with as a TA when I was in graduate school, and then when I was at the University of Missouri. I'm working with students that often come from an agricultural background, or a rural community and are coming to a bigger town for the first time and don't maybe have different sorts of experiences with science that, especially when I was working in the, on the East Coast, there was a very different view about science communication and about science engagement. And those are all just things that I feel like have kind of informed and shaped my perspective and my research. I don't have I haven't really been in the discipline of education, but I'm teaching, obviously, and think about it all the time, and really thinking about the parallels that we see in science education and science communication that I hope to talk to you more about today. Okay, whoops, went backward there. So today, I know that was kind of a long intro, but I think it's sometimes helpful to know about kind of where your speaker, where their perspective is coming from. I want to share with you this idea of the science of science communication. I also wanted to talk about a couple of theories and frameworks and approaches that I have found to be very insightful and informative, that we're seeing evidence in other published work about how people understand science, science issues, and how we might integrate some of this into science education. I want to give a kind of shout out to Dr. Nicole Kelp and Hannah and Jasmine, whose their talk is available online as well. And I feel like I wanted to kind of expand on that with some additional theories and perspectives, but also encourage you to go back to that one. And I'm also really excited for the next one when Liz and Aaron, I think, are going to share some work that they're doing in their classes. And I think hopefully there'll be a lot of continuity between these. So I also want to talk about just how we can think about incorporating the science of science communication into education and training that we're providing for our students. And if we have time, I'd love to share a little bit about a recent project I've worked on that might have some insights that are helpful to you all. The data is very much in its preliminary stage, so I have just kind of some key insights to share on that. Okay, so you may have heard this term. I know it's probably come up in network events so far, but the term of the science of science communication. And you might be wondering what that all means. I wanted to share a little bit about what we mean by that. And this is from when I was at my postdoc at the Annenberg Public Policy Center. We worked on a book, the Oxford Handbook of the Science of Science Communication, with multiple authors, which is a great book. It's unfortunately kind of expensive, but it's a great book with some great articles about science communication from a lot of different angles. But one of the chapters I worked on was an overview of what we mean by the science of science communication. And some of what I'm going to talk about today draws on that. And what we really mean by that is that it's an area of study that is really systematically using scientific methods to evaluate how scientists and how others convey scientific information, how the public receives it, how they interpret it, and the social and political aspects of all of those dynamics, which is very obviously very complicated. I like to reinforce again and again that we are using social science methods to understand how science is communicated. So this is rigorous science applied to understand these processes, yet they are incredibly complicated. Anyone working in the field of education, communication, psychology knows that we often, our conclusions are often complex, right? There are many limitations to trying to understand kind of how humans are processing information, how they're receiving and learning from it. So we're really looking at science communication systematically as possible. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about with the network today, and I'm sure it's come up again, I feel like I need to use the practices I'm learning of communicating almost about misinformation. What we learn about communicating about misinformation is that we don't want to keep repeating it over and over again. That just reinforces the idea. However, I do want to note this as a point of something that as researchers, we should all reflect upon. And it's the idea of this knowledge deficit model that was kind of introduced or pointed out several decades ago, that this is science communication was originally thought of as the goal was just to increase science literacy. And as long as we are putting our information out there, even if we're putting it out incredibly well, if we're representing the scientific evidence well, the public or our audience will then receive it, they will take it in, they will understand it, and they will be likely in some sort of support of that, of the evidence, or their view will be in line with what the scientific evidence says. So for instance, that the fact that, we say somewhere between 97 and 99% of climate scientists believe that climate change is human caused and is occurring, that we would share that information, and thus people would be like, okay, climate change is happening, it is occurring, and we bought into that. But it really does not work quite in that way. Sorry, I keep clicking on the wrong place here. And we often see this, actually, I'm kind of critiquing the field of science communication as well, because this keeps persisting in a lot of science communication work. And I even find myself falling into this as well, that often, I'll be writing a paper or a grant proposal, and I say to myself, I will have written it into a comment, this is sounding very knowledge deficit-y, that we are, what we're trying to do is put information out there. And that is a really an important goal, right? We want to obviously share scientific evidence. It's important information to get out there. We know that it has important information that can be used in people's decision-making to improve their health, the environment, livelihoods, all sorts of things. However, it isn't going to work. Solely communicating information out there alone is not going to work. And I see this often in research that's published. I see it happening even in my own mind, that we just need to get the information out there. We see it often. And it's not to say that getting good information about science out to different audiences is not an important goal. However, we have to think about it, that realize that it's a lot more kind of complex situation that we're dealing with. And I also think about this as an educator, because in the space, when we're working in the field of education, our priority, we deeply value knowledge, and we want to share that information. Our goal is to share information and knowledge with our students. We deeply value it, we prioritize it. It's the way that our classes are set up to distribute information, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that alone will result in some sort of particular attitude. The environment even of the way that we structure classes, the way that we kind of, I was talking to Liz and Aaron about this the other day, the way that we present material is really kind of rests on this same idea that we just need to transmit the information, especially when we're thinking, and perhaps even in the classroom as well. When we're thinking about sharing information, we really need to recognize that it is a lot more complex, that there's really a lot more underlying how people shape their views, even how they consider the information that they're thinking about or that they're learning about. A couple of the frameworks I wanted to talk about today are about the complexity of that. The knowledge deficit model idea is not working because what really is happening is much more complex. For instance, just sharing information about scientific issues or scientific knowledge does not will not just transfer over, meaning support for science as an institution, as in regards to a specific issue, for support for a specific policy. Time and again, this has kind of been found to be the case. It also wouldn't necessarily mean that sharing that information will yield concern about the topic. Climate change being one that's such a model case of this, that the stakes are incredibly high, right? How everyone will be impacted, is being impacted by this issue, is not equating to the concern, right? And this is in part because we often interpret information with different kinds of goals. We often refer to this as motivated reasoning. And I'd wonder, and I'd love discussion about this. I don't know if we'll have time today, but in whatever format we can to have more discussion about this. But how we often approach information is through a motivated type of thinking, which either can mean that we're coming to information with the goal of either supporting our pre-existing views or to be accurate. Sometimes it's a mix of both. So we might be wanting to, they've found this through eye tracking studies and things like that, and recall tests, that when you scan information, you might be scanning to actually pick out information that resonates with your pre-existing views and spending less time on the information that contradicts those views. Or we might be in sort of a deep thinking mode where we actually do want to learn and form kind of accurate conclusions about the information. And I wondered, I don't know again that we'll have time to discuss, but often students come into a classroom, right? They're probably more kind of primed and ready to be thinking about learning, to be driven to come to an accurate conclusion, or to form an accurate view based on the information they're given. And surely they might be motivated by, a specific grade. They want to, get the test questions correct, or, write the paper that will reflect to their instructor what they know the goals of the course to be. But out there in, the kind of other context outside of classrooms, this is happening very differently. This is just an example. It shares some of the same information I shared just now. But I love this this kind of depiction that Dan Kahan, who's a scholar, he works on an area that he calls cultural cognition, which is really about how one of the ways we're sort of motivated to absorb information, to interpret information, is through our kind of cultural perspective. And often this is aligned, and perhaps more so even than when he began this work. I don't know that I can say that for sure, but really aligned with our cultural political groups, right? That we've associated, we've begun to kind of like associate our political group that we identify with as our cultural group, and that we interpret information through that kind of lens, and are responding to things because it will, or forming a perception about things to be in line with that cultural group. He refers to this as cultural cognition. And this is just a graph that kind of illustrates how this happened. And in some of his other work, he's depicted this as well, that people essentially will, even as stronger, like the stronger you are and the kind of more you're kind of dug into that cultural group, the more likely you are to use that type of cognition over a more kind of like fact-based, accuracy-based cognition, which is just really interesting. I was on a call last week, and we were talking about a project to work with landowners about conservation efforts, and talking about how tricky that can be. And one of the comments made by my colleague was about how, well, among this group that he knows, he's like, if he, about a particular farmer he was thinking about, if he went into the coffee shop and started talking about how concerned he is about climate change, that would be, he was like, he said the words, that would essentially be social suicide, as though he felt like it's so important to maintain our kind of social cultural groups that we are willing to kind of dismiss other things because of that, the importance of having that sort of social cohesion, right? And so to maintain our kind of social cohesion, we will align our views with those, even if we kind of know that they're not scientifically or otherwise accurate. So this motivated reasoning process is really powerful, which is daunting for researchers, right? There are ways that we can kind of address this. One is through really encouraging kind of central processing. If anyone's familiar with this, like two modes of processing that we can be in. One is very quick, making very quick judgments. That does not lend itself well to sort of accuracy, coming to accurate conclusions or learning. But central processing, more deep thinking about issues can be, and then can be more persuasive and effective at conveying information. We can also use, I worked on a study, I didn't want to share it today, felt a little too off topic, but we can also think about priming people's identities in order to get them to think differently about topics. So that might be to prime a particular, prime a particular identity. The study I was referring to, we did some testing with different political figures about climate change, and found that when we sort of primed people by using a Democrat as talking about climate change, that particularly among conservatives, that reinforced the sort of conservative identity protection in how they thought about the issue. But other types of messengers and speakers might do that differently. So we can either kind of try to remove the kind of priming of an identity, or we can reinforce it depending on the goals of our communications. We can also think about, when we're thinking about science communication, that in a classroom, as I was kind of mentioning before, students might be more kind of primed to come to an accurate conclusion about something, whether it's for tests or just to know that that's what they need to learn from the course. But outside of classrooms, this might function a little bit differently. And there are ways that we can prime and encourage people to make a more accurate conclusion based on the scientific evidence. That might be through through asking them to describe counter arguments in more detail, to read more about something and then be able to respond to it. There are different techniques for doing this. So motivated reasoning isn't intended to be like, oh, we're out of luck here. This is always how people are going to think. It's just some of the work that we're doing in this area is to think about how we can kind of prime that accuracy motivation, but knowing that that alone isn't always necessarily going to solve the problem. So this is a little bit of my kind of experimental part of this presentation that isn't necessarily linked to specific research I've done, but things I'm thinking about, wanted to kind of share with the network, would love to continue these conversations through the network. That there are often there are differences between the fields of science communication and science education. However, I put this in a paper that a few years ago, and have continued to kind of want to come back to it, but I'm not quite sure how, but maybe the network is part of that somehow. Both fields of science and education and science communication, I have many colleagues who are like, those are different things. They do not, they have different goals and objectives, and that may in some cases be true. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity from the fields relying on each other more in terms of using learning theories, but also kind of models like motivated reasoning or cultural cognition, to understand that more, to use things like Nicole talked about the value belief, the theory of planned behavior and the health belief model, employing those kinds of models. That's demonstrating how we're using those in science education and science communication education research more, which is great. It is important to note that the contexts are different. And I think as we're thinking about integrating science communication education, as we're thinking about developing that sometimes the contexts are different than the actual environment that we're working with students in to develop their science communication competencies. So when we're in education, we're really relying on communicating with a captive audience, right? We have a classroom of students who they're actually not as captive as I would like them to be. They actually probably are, checking their phones quite more frequently than I would like, but they're essentially captive audiences, right? They're there, they are motivated to learn the material. But when we're thinking about the public space, we have to think about this much differently. And science communication will often even rely on tools from the field of journalism, which thinks about how you present, how you structure a message, because one of the primary goals is just getting sort of attention or encouraging engagement in some form. And so if you think about if anyone took a journalism course or has worked in journalism, and you learn the inverted pyramid model, or you learn about writing a lead, you're trying to capture your audience's attention. And so that is one of the sort of the principles of communication that I don't know that we're always thinking about in education, because we have that captive audience of students in our classroom. And I'm wondering, I don't have it's kind of an abstract question, but whether that kind of seeps into students' views about science communication, because they think, oh, I can take what I'm doing here in this classroom, I can go do it out in another space and it will work the same way. But in fact, it will probably work quite differently and will work very differently depending on the audience. And it might also be, I don't know this for sure, but when we're in a classroom where we have the opportunity to talk about sort of the uncertainty, sometimes the limitations of scientific evidence, how the process can sometimes be, maybe there's a little more comfort with that being sometimes a messy process, or being a long-term process in which we have to kind of culminate evidence over time. Whereas when we go out and we're communicating with others, there might be less tolerance for that kind of uncertainty or unclear, not being really clear about the process of science in general. And so one of the things that, I'm finding as I'm kind of putting on my two hats here as an educator and a science communication researcher, is the really critical need of practice and experience in science communication. And I would encourage it even, outside, within the classroom, within students that are in the class, but encouraging students to experiment with science communication in other places, in other venues. So kind of a tangent here, but related, that the project that I'm working on, a project that I've been working on for a few years, we started doing a really a mini science communication course for students. We offered it to students, and this was taken across students that were undergraduate or graduate. Many were in scientific disciplines, some were not, but I think the majority were. And this is probably maybe different from how some of you are thinking about science communication training, but we really felt there's a strong collaboration across at my university, at University of Nebraska, Lincoln, of people interested in science communication, and they're across the campuses. They're in biology, chemistry, College of Ag, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. And so it's a great ground for kind of testing these sorts of things. But we had an internal grant, and we did a science communication training that was offered for 1 credit or no credit. It was literally just 4 sessions. And we're working on this, but I'd love to share some details about our workshops and what we found with the network. We literally just did 4 sessions of science communication training that were 2 hours each. But one thing we also included in these were with one of my collaborators, who I showed here. Her name's Dr. Eileen Hebetz, and she does research with spiders. One of her goals was really to give students opportunities that will minimize fears about spiders. And I also really got interested in the idea of fostering curiosity about spiders. As we've talked about sort of with motivated reasoning and with other things, some of the topics that came up in Nicole's and Hannah and Jasmine's talk. Emotion really comes into play. And so we kind of had this cool opportunity to create this science communication training, but there was also kind of an experiential learning piece in it, where my colleague Eileen has created a kind of pop-up exhibit that's about spiders called Eight-Legged Encounters. And we had students go out and actually facilitate eight-legged encounters at a few different places across the state. We had one, they were in different places, but essentially this was like a 3 or 4 session workshop, and then students could do this outreach event. And the goal, as I mentioned, that we really wanted to think about this issue of fear. There are so many layers to this project, so I apologize that it's kind of hard to like describe very briefly. But I think it relates in some ways to other controversial topics because it has to do with this idea of fear, right? And how can we kind of cultivate attitudes, maybe not just toward science communication and potentially being more engaged with other audiences, but then how does that in turn change our students? And not even just about changing them in terms of what they can do in terms of communication. Does it change their views about other things? And what we, again, sorry, I'm kind of recapping this, but we really were focused on developing their skills, learning about an informal science learning, facilitating a public outreach event, and thinking about both their views towards science communication training and their fear and curiosity towards spiders. We also had like an eye tracking element and a heart rate monitor involved, but I'm not going to share that data with you today. That's it's like overwhelming in its nature, but it had a lot going on. But what we did find was that students reported that those who, so we had a group of probably in total about 75 to 78 students who have participated in this workshop, and who some did this Eight-Legged Encounters event, some did not. And we found that those who did this Eight-Legged Encounters event, so this was literally an afternoon where they went and kind of helped at a table to facilitate an outreach event, that we showed changes in their confidence in science communication, their interest in doing it more. But then it also actually, we also actually found that they had, they reported that it changed their views towards spiders. And we had a lot more kind of measures involved in the study, including a well-validated spider phobia questionnaire and a spider curiosity questionnaire. And so it's kind of interesting result that one kind of argument for investing in more science communication for our students is that it's not just about encouraging them to get out and do more communication, learn about some of the best practices, be able to talk about their own research, be able to engage with publics, but that it actually can have these like additional benefits in terms of changing their attitudes. And I think we see this too in really other kind of other spheres where it might even impact people's views about their own science. It might give them, I know this has happened to me kind of anecdotally, where I do some sort of engagement, community engagement activity, and it actually makes me think differently about my own research. And so I think this is evidence for that we know there are a lot of benefits to cultivating science communication skills. I'm probably kind of preaching to the choir about that, but there may be more to this that can change. And the case of spiders is random, right? It's it would depend on you having a spider researcher that you collaborate with. But what I do think is that many of us probably work in interdisciplinary teams, and there might be opportunities for you to think of some creative ways to encourage students to do even a small bit of kind of outreach activity, public engagement activity, because it really can enhance those skills. You're actually, putting it into practice, but maybe in kind of a low stakes environment. It doesn't necessarily have to be about climate change, about vaccine hesitancy or something like that. That those kind of like experiences and practice, to what degree they're possible, can really augment the impacts of learning about science communication. Okay, so there was one other random idea, again, that this is something that actually I'm going to skip ahead here for a second. One of the things that's come up in some different SCERN events that that I think a lot about, and I have really only used this in a class and not collected data on this, but sort of a tool or a practice that I've started to do more in my courses that are focused on science communication comes from some other work I've done from working on interdisciplinary teams. I've taught a class in communication campaigns. And then I recently was working with a UX UI, which is user experience, user interface designer who is helping us design a platform. And we used this and I kind of connected the dots and I was like, this tool really, it actually comes from kind of different fields. But I found that it can be really helpful for students when they're trying to think about and potentially empathize with an audience. So if anyone's done this, something like this before, that it's actually kind of a weird kind of activity. You might feel a little bit odd doing this, but you develop an actual audience persona. And we see research like the Yale Center for Climate Change Communications will do some kind of audience segmentation analysis, and then they kind of give a profile to different people from different kind of segments. And it actually helps, I think, build kind of an empathy or a connection to an audience and really focus in on an audience. And there are many worksheets like this available online if anyone wants to, search. These don't always have the best fields. The one I used just didn't look as nice in my presentation, but it's really the idea of envisioning a member of your audience, even giving them a face or a photo, thinking about their age, their gender, their location, what they do, their job, but perhaps even more importantly, is to think about some of their underlying values and goals and motivations, to think about challenges and obstacles that they may face in their life, in their day-to-day. Often when we're thinking about these controversial topics and why people might, like not really thinking about the scientific evidence, we realize that they're dealing with a lot in their lives that is competing for that kind of brain space or their attention or the urgency or their needs, and thinking about where they go for where they go as trusted sources of information. These kinds of activities I find can be really helpful for empathy building. So that was one thing I wanted to share. Another idea I wanted to share with the network, because I have your time here and I know we're getting very close to needing to go into Q&A, but it's kind of an idea I want to float with the network about maybe a kind of a lesson or a activity that we might think about doing with students that are in different fields and kind of see how this goes. And I want to give credit. I saw a great speaker a few weeks ago. Her name's Anna Farrow Henderson, and she wrote a book she was a geoscientist and she ended up working into policy, and now she works kind of in philanthropy, but she wrote a beautiful book called Core Samples. And this was just a kind of a comment in her talk. So I highly recommend the book, but this was just a comment that she made, that she thinks about science communication as a research question. And she said the answer is usually always engagement. Well, her comment that science communication is a research question really got me thinking that one thing we might do with our students who are kind of familiar with the process of science is to think about science communication and invite them to pose a science communication hypothesis in some way. And this might encourage them to both we're going to take them through the whole process of research that we think about, looking at the literature in order to know their audience, think about science communication theories, looking at evidence that's out there, and then pose an actual research question on science communication. Will a specific message framing on social media have more engagement than another type of framing? What will the comments to that be? What will the sentiment of the comments be? What if you have a conversation or ask your friends or sorority or student organization or friends a question about their views about the risks and benefits of a certain science and technology issue, what will they hear the most? And then actually ask them to document, capture the data, analyze and discuss the results. And what my hope, or what I would hypothesize, is that this would allow students to really both think about using social science research methods, also seeing the complexity of social science, to think about, using the scientific method to ask these questions and get evidence and maybe be surprised by the results. And also that idea of knowing our audience, that can be really hard. I find even when I give trainings about science communication and I'm like, know your audience, it's really hard to invest the time in doing that or know how to do it. But asking students to really do that and really reflect on that whole process. So it was kind of an idea I thought I would throw out to the network, and maybe at some point we could devise some kind of research to study whether this could be an effective tool in learning science communication. And I think I will pause there, but I'm really going to look forward to questions and answers and any comments you all have after our breakout rooms.
Yes. Thank you so much, Heather. That was awesome. So we are going to go to our Q&A portion of the talk now. So like I said, since the network is trying to build connections, we're going to do a quick a breakout room to decide what is one question you would like answered or one takeaway from this talk you would like to share, right? So you're going to type out your question and our takeaway in a Google Doc that that Erin is going to share, and the speaker will choose to respond to some of those questions when we return. Now, you will only have 3 minutes to come up with one, and we'll send you a 30-second warning. All right, we'll see you all back here in 3 minutes.